to share with the field some of what we're finding as we think about all of these buckets of work that we're doing around talent and DEI. So we hope to be full service, thinking about how we can center equity in the work of talent advising and coaching in the education space in particular. And so when we focus in on that research bucket in particular, many of you on the line are likely familiar with, in 2017, we released a report to the field called Unrealized Impact, where we were really talking about using a big old data set from education organizations across the country to tell the quantitative story about and make a case for diversity, inclusion, and equity in our sector. And so at that point, our data was really was broad. And at this point, we've been continuing since 2017 to add to our data set. So we now have something like 20,000 plus responses from 400 plus organizations that are continuing to help us to understand trends around diversity, inclusion, and equity in the education space in particular, more broadly. And we've organized that data into a lovely quantitative scatter plot to help us tell stories and capture trends of the key successes and key challenges that we're facing in our sector. But we learned in 2017 that there are really many ways to tell a story, not just the quantitative one. And the question that kept coming up for us as we were presenting our data at conferences and to individual organizations, like, I get the numbers, but what do organizations' real DEI journeys really look like? What does it feel like to be in an organization? What does it look like to be in an organization that's engaging in this work really deeply? And so we double clicked on the idea that the quantitative story is one way to tell what DEI looks like, but our case studies were really the qualitative way for us to tell the story about what DEI looks like in organizations. And we decided that in this case study work that we wanted to do it differently than a traditional linear project where you'd say we started here and we ended there and we arrived, but rather we wanted to take a really radically human approach to case studies that emphasize the messiness, the vulnerability, multidimensional challenges as opposed to linear challenges that come up when we're talking about really human work of building more inclusive and more equitable organizations. And we were really privileged and honored to work with 3 organizations that decided to go on this vulnerable journey with us. And those 3 organizations, who's on the line with us today, were Blue Engine, College Track, and TNTP. We have to pause here to say to set a huge bout of gratitude to these 3 organizations who have engaged with us in this work, in part because it's already really challenging to be vulnerable about the inherent messiness of doing human work, but it is even more challenging to do that on a really public stage where you don't get to qualify the story or the details of the story every time someone picks up the written case. And so we are incredibly grateful to these 3 organizations who've said, yep, we've signed on to be vulnerable and transparent about where we've succeeded and where we hope to continue iterating and growing. And we're grateful to them for just for being on the line today, to College Track in particular, to being on the line today, to offer some of the context and texture around the moment in time that they were in of the case study and how they've continued to evolve and grow on the diversity, inclusion, and equity front beyond the moment in time of the case study. So without further ado, let's dig in to College Track in particular. I'm going to toss to you, Srito, to paint the picture for us.
So we'd love to hear from Julia and Lisa to give us an overview of what College Track, an organizational overview of what College Track is, so we have a little bit of context, and then we'll dive into some of the themes that we saw emerge in a case study.
So you can see some of the just facts here on the slide for all of you who are watching. But overall, we are a college completion organization. We've been around now for 23 years. We started initially in East Palo Alto in the Bay Area with the idea of making sure that any student who wants to go to college, particularly students from low income first-generation students of color had the opportunity to get on the college track. Over time, our model has evolved to not only include college access, but college completion. And more recently, we actually have now repositioned our mission, as you can see here, to do two things. One, to specifically call out the systemic barriers that shape our students' choices. And two, to be able to understand that the bachelor's degree in itself is actually currency for our students to be able to exercise a life of opportunity, choice, and power. So we now serve over 3,400 students across 5 regions, as you can see here, 4 states, and the District of Columbia, and we are continuing to grow, and we'll be growing to serve 5,000 students by 2024.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Elisa. So since College Track's founding in 1997, it has held and retained a focus on hiring staff who represent the students that they serve and who hold and can connect with those experiences. And so this has been an ingrained value for College Track throughout its history. And as a result, it's been able to maintain a highly diverse staff, even as it's grown. And in 2017, College Track took Promise54's DEI staff experience survey. And what you see here is a scatter plot of the ways that we sort of categorize organizations based on 3 different measures. On the x-axis, you see inclusion, levels of inclusion, perceived inclusion by staff. On the y-axis, you see diversity in terms of staff demographics. And then you see the dots that are either yellow to blue to purple, and those are experience levels of equity. And so because of its high levels of diversity and its cultural context at the time, in 2017, when College Track took the staff experience survey, it landed in the advanced quadrant, meaning that there were high levels of diversity and that staff experienced relatively high levels of equity and inclusion. And during this time, College Track was in the midst of continuous expansion. So within the course of a couple of years, College Track had grown from its original site in California to now, as Elisa mentioned, several sites across 4 states, DC, growing to now serve close to 5,000 students. And it added a new site almost every year for the past decade. And so ultimately this rapid growth began to outpace the communication and culture that it once held in terms of being in a single place, being able to connect in more informal ways. And so in 2018, when they retook the survey, they had retained their levels of diversity, but there were the level of perceived inclusion and experienced inclusion by staff had dropped. Which then moved it to the diversified quadrant. And so in reflecting on the survey results and staff feedback that they received throughout this process and throughout engaging in this work, College Track then continued to engage in its DI work and grappled with how to move the work forward given its large and ever-changing context. It's moving to new cities, to different contexts, it's continuing to expand. So what does that mean as it begins to tackle, not just begins, but continues to tackle DEI work within its organization and thinking about their staff's experience? And so there were a couple of key themes that we saw emerge in exploring College Track's journey. The first of which being that while College Track has successfully maintained a diverse staff throughout its history, it's now working to explicitly codify and systematize some of these diversity generating practices in order to ensure it can continue to be a highly diverse organization as it grows. So while it's been an embedded value, they're trying to really codify it and turn it into systems that sustain. Leadership acknowledges, though, that its diversity has not automatically guaranteed feelings of inclusion among its staff. So College Track is grappling with what staff experience as implicit dominant norms and expectations, which then lead to lower perceptions of inclusion from staff. Staff feeling like, well, there are these sort of implicit norms that I don't always feel like, if I don't feel like I fit those, then I don't necessarily feel like I'm included or I'm as valued. And so College Track is working to really acknowledge and dive into what does this mean and why is this happening. And as College Track continues to grow, it's struggled to expand its communication structures in line. And it can no longer rely on informal or sort of water cooler staff connections. Its much larger size and geographic spread means that they really have to be much more intentional and structured with how they not only communicate, but also engage in decision-making processes in ways that make staff feel included, engaged, and connected to leadership and to each other. So these questions become more challenging as an organization grows. And then finally, in moving its DEI work forward, College Track began its work to develop a shared DEI belief statement and DEI definitions, because they understand that having a shared understanding of the why behind the work and what they mean when they say diversity, equity, and inclusion is a really important foundation in moving the work forward, not just with leadership, but with its entire staff. So these are some of the key themes that we saw emerge as we explored College Track's journey. And then I'll show you a short clip of where we last left off when the case studies were released. And then we'll hear some quick updates, like where are they now from Elisa and Julia.
And I think to have the philosophy, I think our next phase is really defining each of those letters in that acronym. What is diversity? What is equity? What is inclusion? And really being clear about that. Once we're clear about that.
Sorry.
The philosophy, I think our next phase is really defining each of those letters in that acronym. What is diversity? What is equity? What is inclusion? And really being clear about that. Once we're clear about that, then we can communicate that to all the staff, and it'll be a lot more easy to digest, and people will feel like this is something they can get behind. And then once all of that is kind of clearly defined, then we can start to create some ways of really incorporating this into other systems and processes that we have right now within the organization. So into our hiring process, we can do this and implement this into our onboarding process. But then ongoing, making sure that it's part of our employee survey as well, so that we can continue to kind of rate ourselves and understand, like, are we really delivering what the employees are expecting to really have a larger impact on whether or not they decide to stay here longer. Our work, as I've shared before, is 8 to 10 years. So the longer employees are here, the stronger the relationship with the students, which is going to lead to better success.
So what gives me hope for College Track are the people. Quite frankly, like the people that I work with, I know they have my back. What College Track has learned through this work are that people matter, right? We need to be listening to our people and really highlighting those stories and voices. That's how we're going to see the changes we want to see in nonprofits, and particularly with College Track, is by listening and really being able to make changes quickly. I think with a lot of nonprofits, we move slow, and I think we lose good people by reacting instead of investing first and foremost.
So I'll now turn it over to Elisa and Julia for some updates as to what's happened since.
Thank you, Lucerito. So just a few items here on the slide and just some broader voiceover. We have our DEI statement, which you heard Marshall speak a little bit about, and the process by which we finalized that DEI statement was actually incredibly inclusive. We had a full town hall. We had multiple opportunities for folks to weigh in. In addition to that, we also rolled out a 2020 plan for this year that included priorities around our DEI definitions, which we just rolled out in February. So as Marshall talked about, the D, the E, and the I. I think the big learning there in how we rolled those out, well, one, we also solicited feedback in a way that we hadn't done before, which I think is continuing to exercise that muscle on how we are getting input up front. But two key pieces of how we rolled those definitions out to the organization that I thought was a big learning for us and a big win was one, naming the inherent tensions in D, E, and I, and particularly me naming those tensions as a CEO and a person in power, how we're vulnerably wrestling with those tensions and how sometimes there's conflicting challenges, right? Like this work is hard. So I think that was really critical. And then second, we also had members of our DEI working group, which we've established and now are meeting regularly. Also talk a little bit about how that shows up in their own work. And then third, we also had a all staff kind of slide out because it had to be virtual because we are, all across the country, actually talk a little bit about how it shows up for each and every person in the organization. And it was an opportunity for me. It was one, the most interactive virtual all staff that we've ever had. And two, there was a level of authenticity that I actually didn't expect. And vulnerability that came from our sites, which was just a big thing to celebrate. The second piece here that you see is around our DEI training. So we're really grateful that Promise54 helped us really be deliberate about understanding what type of approach we want to take with training. So we now have a mental model where we have kind of baseline trainings for the entire organization that's really rooted in the data that came out of our 2018 survey, which seems like forever ago. In nonprofit time, things go fast. And so we have particular modules around microaggressions and creating inclusive spaces for LGBTQ team members, in part because those were two pieces that came up in our data that we really wanted to focus on, in addition to some kind of other baseline training. So there'll be 6 modules that we will be rolling out. And then we will provide some, and those will be virtual modules. There'll be some in-person time for teams to process. And so we're super excited about that, with the option to do some build-on modules for folks who are really interested and want to continue to do some deeper DEI work. And then the last piece here, the last bullet, I actually want to turn over to Julia to talk a little bit more about some of the pieces that we've done around communications and career pathways, which were also big pieces of feedback that came up in our survey results. And I want to pass it over to Julia specifically as the Chief Finance and Operating Officer in the organization, in part because one thing that we have held to be firm in our work around DEI is that this is not separate work. DEI strategy is org strategy, and so it shows up in everything that we do. It's why we don't have a separate DEI person. That also makes it very difficult because we have to integrate all the work into every part of our infrastructure, but that's also intentional, such that we can build capacity long-term, so that when me and Julia are no longer at College Track, we actually have the infrastructure and mindsets and assumptions in place so that folks can continue the work forward. So with that, I'll hand it over to Julia.
Thanks, Elisa. Elisa and I joke about this, which is we're trying to create DEI at College Track in such a way that if someone came in here and wanted to do something different, they would have to very actively do that and meet a lot of resistance, just because it was so integrated into the organization that asking our staff to do something different or be in a different environment would require so much resistance. And that's our secret plan. As we think about our DEI work. As we go into sort of thinking about what our DEI priorities are for 2024, Elisa is absolutely right in terms of how we are thinking about it, which is DEI is like the air we breathe at College Track. It's embedded in everything we do. It's not a separate stream of work for anything we do. It is within the stream of work of everything we do. And so our 4 strategies as it relates to our 2024 plan is the first, infusing the DEI philosophy in College Track systems, structures, and practices. And so whether that's incorporating it into a revised performance evaluation and compensation process, or thinking about it as it relates to goal setting or what have you, it's all part of the work that we're doing. Secondly is the work around additional DEI trainings that we are already starting up. Thirdly is an approach for decision making and just getting really clear on who is responsible for what. The reason this one and the next one, which is having a framework for gathering stakeholder input and following up on solicited feedback is important, is because while College Track is very strong on the D, the diversity piece, the way equity and inclusion looks at College Track from what we have heard from staff as a result of the surveys that we've conducted is that our opportunity is really around communication. And that means being a lot more deliberate and formalized in how we communicate with our people, how we engage people in feedback. And it's not just about how leadership team, it's how anyone, particularly in our mission support, which are our national departments, when they're rolling a new thing out, are engaging staff and are circling back and sharing with them, thank you for this feedback, here's how we're going to use it, this is what we use and this is what we didn't, and let me tell you why. And as it relates to decision making, just as we have grown very rapidly over the last couple of years, just the informal ways in which we were able to work don't work as well now that we are a larger, much more national organization than 6 years ago or 9 years ago when Elisa started. And so our work is to really formalize that and to codify that in ways that we haven't in the past in order to improve the experience that our staff have, in order to really make progress on the E&I at College Track, which is what those two are really wrapped up in for our staff.
Thank you so much for those updates. And so now we want to open it up for questions. Kimberly and I can kick off with 1 or 2 questions, but at this point we want to invite you to chat in any questions that you might have into the Zoom chat on the bottom right hand side. You should be able to see a little button to chat in questions. So we'd love to hear from you all what you would want Elisa and Julia to speak on in terms of their own journey. So, but I'll turn over to Kimberly to get us started.
Sure. One question that has come up for us as we thought about doing research for this work and connecting with a lot of leaders is that there is a particular way in which we wanted to see if there were any sort of trends that happened in organizations that were white-led versus organizations that were led by folks of color. It's something that we've tried to think about in our quantitative data disaggregation, and certainly something we were thinking about as we were doing this qualitative research. So question for you, Elisa and Julia, as you think about having engaged in this process, how have you personally experienced this work, whether it be DEI work very specific to this moment in time at College Track or DEI work more broadly? How have you experienced it as leaders of color in particular?
I can start. Thank you, Kimberly. So I can't speak from like what the experience feels like for someone who is white or not a person of color, but I can speak from my experience. And my, I think the thing that has been most profound for me is to be in a position of power and think that I was pretty intentional about disrupting ways in which systemic oppression play out. Yet, you know, being called out around like how there are some practices that perpetuate dominant culture, and really figuring out and like reflecting in my leadership around like, what is it that I, like, what do I want to keep and what do I want to throw away? And how do I show up in a way that is vulnerable and not defensive? I think has been a real challenge. I am so incredibly passionate about the work and our students, and you know, do feel deeply connected to the personal mission of the organization, or personally feel connected to the mission of the organization. And so I think it also has been a challenge at time to what sometimes feels like putting the interests of adults over the interests of students. And so there has been moments when I really have to take a step back and be a lot more curious around where some of the feedback and the challenges are coming from, and rather than, you know, jump to a place where folks are not caring about kids, because it's absolutely not the case. And so, I think it's been a wonderful opportunity. And what I have been pushing both Promise54 and the entire field on is around telling the story of organizations that are mostly people of color led. There are very few of us in the nonprofit sector. And there's only going to be more of us as we continue, as demographics change in this country. And so I want it to be true that, there's more folks who are telling this story than there are the ones trying to come to this, as not a person of color. I just think there's a personal element here that we're carrying, particularly with the experiences that I've had, coming from a marginalized community. Like, I just think that there's some interesting nuance that I'm not sure that my white peers would be able to understand.
So I'll offer two things. One is I personally feel like the DEI work that we do is very high stakes because I feel like as a leader of color, and I think a lot of people of color feel this way, is that you feel like you're held to a different standard. And I say that with humility and really from a place of vulnerability. Originally, I did not realize that that portion of the conversation was going to be included even in the case study. And I had several conversations with Promise54 afterwards because I was so worried that it would be construed in a way that is different than my intention. And so even saying in this moment actually feels a little bit hard, and sort of what is at the heart of that for me is just feeling like you can't mess up, feeling like you have to do everything better, even better than perhaps what other people might be held to. And what comes with that isn't just like a standard that we have for ourselves, but just not wanting to let other people down because they're relying on you, because you know what it feels like, and you want to live into DE and I in all of those ways. And this work is not black and white. It's not like being able to teach someone, multiplication and you start with addition and subtraction and all those other things. It doesn't work like that. There isn't a clear straight line, which makes the work already that much harder. And I think that the thing that I struggle with in my role of holding our people function at College Track is I have a lot of energy and a lot of conviction around our diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And at the same time, I find myself having to balance that with having to ask the question, having to balance that with the work that we are in. So I think I struggle with thinking about sort of what does that look like, knowing that even if we do the DE and I perfectly and we don't have really strong student outcomes, what does that mean, right? Does that mean that we'll have done all of the right things? And I don't think that anyone would say so. And so what I am really trying to convey is like, again, it's not black and white. And as an organization, I think each of us have to figure out where that right place is that strikes the right balance between how our staff feel and the student outcomes that we are reaching. Because at the end of the day, that is, that's why all of us are in this work and not doing something else and not, fill in the blank, like making more money or doing whatever, doing more glamorous work or what have you, is because we're in this work because of the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, whether we're in the field of health or education or poverty or whatever it is. And so I think that balancing that is feels a little bit tricky sometimes.
So we had someone want to dig in a little bit more into some of the tensions that you mentioned around like the tensions that exist with DEI, and I feel like these themes that Julia that you're speaking of might be connected to some of the things you referenced, Elisa. So I'm curious to dig in a little bit as to how you experience tensions as you're seeing the work lay out, and how you communicate around that in terms of aligning the organizational vision and mission to the importance of DEI, and how those two do connect and overlap.
I guess I'll take a first crack at it and say that that's why the work that we're doing around communication is so important, right? Because in the absence of being really clear about what our expectations of what inclusivity means, not just in the organization, but for a given thing looks, that helps us be really clear, right? So for example, as we went through our 2024 business planning process, we engaged every staff member in the organization in that work. And then there are other decisions that we make at College Track for which we don't do that, where that's not necessary. And so I think that in order to think about what it means to be inclusive, we actually have to have different ways of thinking about it, and being really clear upfront as much as possible around what the expectation of the I in particular looks like, so that folks aren't like thinking, well, I should have been included in this, whereas the organization could have actually said up front, here's how you're going to be included in this or not, and here's why, and here's how your feedback is going to be used. And I think it has been, at least at College Track, us being inconsistent and in our rigor around that has resulted in a lack of clarity in terms of expectations of being included in something, and therefore how inclusive they experience the organization to be.
Yeah, I would offer a pretty specific example that came up as we were defining our DE&I, particularly around equity. And there was lots and back and forth about how we define equity and specific examples. And the biggest tension that came up within that conversation is that we wanted to be really clear that that the difference between equity and equality, that equal doesn't necessarily mean that it is equitable. And we're an organization that is 300 employees, 150 full-time, 150 part-time. We're serving 5,000 students, or we're getting ready to, and we need some policies that are actually consistent, right, in order to just operate. And so being able to figure out, like, how do we lift up the tension of equity within the constraints that exist, and not from a place of a lack of imagination, right? Like, I don't want us to ever think that like things are not possible and that we just live in a world of limits. And we also live in a world of limits, right? And so like being able to balance those two things, particularly around resources. So this comes up a lot around resources. In scholarships, for example, we have a crazy way that we allocate resources on scholarships that is not the same. It is not equal. Not every single student gets the same amount because it's very much based on need. The framework for how we diagnose need, however, is consistent, right? We look at EFC and we look at, you know, gaps in aid. And so I think having, being more clear with the organization around like where we're able to more individualize and personalize for staff and students in order to achieve equity, and that they should expect that there will be some policies that are going to be adjusting for difference. And yet there is a framework in which we need to be operating that actually does have consistent values and principles. And so that, I think, has been the trickiest thing to communicate, quite frankly. I'm not even sure that we have done a great job even of communicating. There's one line in our definition that says sometimes to achieve equity, we will differentiate. And I think there are still some folks that don't quite understand what that means. So that nuance is hard.
This is certainly a testament to how well you've already started to tell your story, but there are lots of great questions coming up in the chat. So I'm going to try to pepper you with them and consolidate where there are some places where it feels like there's some good overlap. So there are these great questions that are coming up about, in part, about kind of the shift in organizational profile from 2017 to 2018. And so Isaac asked this question, how was the reaction from College Track staff to learning that the organizational profile had shifted? And did that, have implications on how you were able to move the work forward and remobilize folks towards some organizational change? I'm going to toss that one in there, but it might be helpful if you two could divide and conquer to share a little bit about this implicit norms piece that was also in the air as you all were trying to navigate this organizational profile shift in communication. So if you can name an example of how that manifested, it may or may not be related to the organizational profile shift, but an implicit norms piece, how did that manifest, and then how did you all try and tackle it and make that a little bit more explicit in your work?
So I'll take the kind of the shift from 17 to 18 and kind of how we tackled that. And I think for some folks it was motivating, and for others I think it was hard, as all things are, a little bit of both. So I think, one thing we had to our benefit in the organization is that while the staff experience survey that we received from Promise54 had a more deliberate nature around asking questions around inclusion, we actually did have our own staff experience survey and we've been conducting it since 2011, that did show that there was a trend around communication and decision-making being a pain point for the organization. So in 2018, it wasn't necessarily a surprise to us that that this was an area of opportunity, because it had been a trend. And I do think that a lot of it was wrapped up and is wrapped up in our growth and our infrastructure. And I think for some folks, I think particularly folks on the DEI working group, they were motivated by the fact that like, we were once here, we can get back here, right? So like who we are as an organization is a place that is inclusive and valuable and all the things. And that we actually, there is a muscle here that we just need to exercise differently. And I think for other folks, I think it reaffirmed a narrative that we were prioritizing growth over quality. And what I mean by that is that, as we continue to grow, there absolutely were folks that were like, why are we continuing to grow? Why are we serving more students in other regions when there's plenty of more students in this particular region to serve? And again, I think that's another tension where we can exercise not either or thinking. It could be both and I would just offer up, as going back to Julia's comment earlier around like, we can have a perfectly executed DEI strategy, but if we're actually not getting outcomes for students, like, that's not, we exist in the world in order to serve our students well. And while we have moved, right, the quadrant in between 18 and 17, I would not take back the decision to open up in DC and serve the now 150 students that we are currently serving there. And so I think it's around kind of framing, like, what are the trade-offs and and building momentum. And then the DEI working group that now is in place, I think has really been able to mobilize and return us to that idea that like, actually, this is who we are and we can do it. And like, these are natural growing pains.
The only thing I would say relative to implicit bias is that what is true at College Track is that we are primarily a very heteronormative organization, both at the leadership level, but more broadly. And that's one of the ways, among other ways, that we are thinking about diversity more broadly in the organization. I also think that as an organization, we need to be increasingly in the practice of thinking about RD in much more broader ways. For example, as parents, as people of various different age groups, of various learning styles and whatnot. And the way that we have tried to make some progress on this is really leaning into our DEI working group. It has been really helpful in order to be able to go to a group that can offer their additional thought partnership and wisdom in this work. I see that, for example, one of the question was around, in the absence of having sort of someone who is dedicated to DEI as their job, how do we make sure DEI is incorporated in our work? Well, one of the ways is, for example, we're in the process of evolving our existing performance evaluation and compensation process. And there are touch points along the way in this project in which we are going to the DEI working group and asking and soliciting their thought partnership. We're going to other groups as well, but that way we are sure that we are gathering that wisdom, that specific wisdom and insight, in addition to other perspectives that we might need to have.
Really appreciate that you even touched on one of the other questions in the chat, Julia, around what does it mean if you don't have a dedicated DEI person? How do you actually ensure that it feels like a collective responsibility around diversity, inclusion, and equity? And I think I've heard you and Elisa name this DEI working group as a key now constituency in the decision-making and pressure testing process as one way to do that. And I'm hearing this revamping of the evaluation structures, performance management and evaluation systems, so that there are actually touch points and beliefs, rallying beliefs around diversity, inclusion, and equity that are actually embedded in how folks are being deemed successful in the organization. So those are two things that I heard you all name in keeping with that question, even though I didn't even ask it just yet. I've got another one to toss at you. So there's this other great question that's floating around in the ether. So there are these conversations that are often happening around diversity where if we are race forward or gender forward in our diversity definitions, is that sufficient, given that it is also possible that one could be a person of color but not necessarily match the lived experience of the students or community that you are serving? So I, as a person of color, may have all sorts of privileges that actually are distinct from the communities that I am serving. And so wondering if that disconnect or tension came up in the conversations that you all were having at College Track at all, and if so, how did you all navigate those?
Yeah, it explicitly has come up as we've talked about DEI training and just kind of what assumptions are kind of floating around in folks' heads. And so in one breath, we say that we want training that is relevant for a mostly people of color organization. And then in another breath, we say, but what does that actually mean? Like, what are we assuming that mostly people of color are actually holding in their brain? And that also, like, people of color are just one monolithic group of people that don't represent, right, like the spectrum of human experience. So yes, it has absolutely come up, and I feel like it's another tension we need to hold, right? Is that, like, I do really strongly believe that going through DEI training as a person of color is a very different experience, and I want curriculum and resources that are going to be honoring and recognizing that experience. I'm talking from a place of having gone through programming that was very much about teaching folks what it means to be a marginalized person when I was actually wearing that identity, and that was really hard for me. And so I want to make sure that we don't perpetuate that same type of training. And also, like, there are many privileges that I hold and that many of us hold that we need to be cognizant of. And so, so I don't know that I have a good answer other than it has come up and it continues to come up. And what we want to, and it's actually in our diversity statement, is that we want to be thinking about diversity from a much broader spectrum and not assuming that, you know, you're super woke just because you're a person of color, or that you have, or if you're not, that you don't have the capacity to be able to understand the lived experiences. So.
Thank you for sharing. I want to circle back to this idea of implicit norms, because this has come up in a couple of streams, including in, like, communication and sort of trying to rethink, like, what communication looks like, feels like at a growing organization of your size. One of the themes that did come up was, you know, staff saying, like, we feel like there's these sort of implicit expectations that are not always made explicit, and, you know, trying to navigate those can feel challenging. From your position, from your standpoint, where do you think these perceptions might be coming from, and how do you make sense of that? Again, given that you, as Elisa, started off as a site director and sort of have had experience throughout the organization.
So I would say that some of it, I think, comes from us actually not being explicit, right? So there's that. And I think one way that we've tried to be more implicit or explicit about professional development in the organization, this actually started in 2016. We partnered with Promise54 to help us come up with our leadership and management framework. That is our actual professional development tool about how we explicitly talk about the behaviors of how you grow in the organization related to an individual contributor, a manager of individuals, a manager of a function. Y'all get it, right? So we have actually laid out the leadership competencies that we believe are opportunities for how you grow in the organization. And we have explicit conversations with staff, not just in their end of year performance evaluation, but also through a 2x2 process that we have 1 to 2 times a year, depending on kind of where you are in your professional development. So I do think that that a way as leaders, I think we can be more explicit around like how you navigate power, how you show up, what are the specific behaviors that are valued in the organization, which is what came out of the Hidden in Plain Sight study that you all were a part of, that was deeply influenced how we think about the work and career development. Where I think we've been less explicit, and we've tried to become more explicit, is in how you are navigating different parts of the organization related to how you influence and how decisions are made. And so one way that we've tried to do that is through like very specific operating principles, creating and publishing our meeting teams of structures that have a clear purpose of how you navigate. But I think if you've been in the organization for a while and you've been successful, like you know how to do it. And if you're relatively new to the organization or relatively new to a multi-layered organization, or even relatively new in your career, I think I've shared with you all that 85% of the folks in our organization are Gen Z or millennial. And so, although millennials are much older now, I'm an older millennial myself, is that there are I think we can be explicit to a certain degree, and I think that folks are still learning. And so to the extent that we can help people navigate the culture that we are in and be as forward as we can, I think is what we need to do. But I do think there's still a learning for us to understand, like, what are we still not being explicit about that folks need to know.
Thank you. So we've got 4 minutes left. We'll squeeze in one last question before we close out. And given that you all have been engaged in DEI work for several years now in a variety of ways, from a variety of angles, and so wondering, have you heard anything from students or partner organizations around the outward facing, the externally facing work that you're doing? Have they noticed any changes based on the internal DEI work that you've done in terms of how that reflects and feels to the larger community?
The two pieces I would offer up, well, one, I also want to qualify that our journey has very much been focused on adults and not on students, which is a place of improvement for us. I mean, I think we went from a place of priority. So there's a whole nother body of work around like how we can do training that's more culturally competent and all sorts of create more welcoming environments. So there's just that I want to offer up. The two pieces that I think specifically are most revealing in terms of our external presence is, one, the changing of our mission, not to use language like underserved, which was there before to describe who our students are, but to be really clear about the environment, the structural barriers that our students are facing, rather than any fault of their own family situation or themselves. And then in how we tell our student stories. And so I think when I joined the organization, I felt like there was this trend of like deficit based, then we went all the way over to super asset based, but a little bit like sanitary, right? Like sanitizing the story. So now I feel like we're swinging back a little bit, not towards a deficit, but really, again, acknowledging the full experience that our students are having, good and bad, interesting and weird, all of the things, right? That our students are full human beings, and we should be telling a story that is dynamic to represent all of the identities and experiences that they are facing. So Yeah, that's, I guess, how I would talk about the external pieces. More work to do on students, for sure.
Gosh, time flies when you're having a good time talking about thorny issues, and just really grateful to you, Alyssa and Julia, for continuing to share your story and how you too have grown as individual leaders in the conversations that you've been leading at College Track over this past clip. So for those of you who are on the line, as we round out in these last couple of minutes together, please do stay engaged with Promise54 and with College Track. The case studies, both College Track story as well as Blue Engine and TNTP stories, are at the link there, case studies at promise54.org. Our final webinar in the 3-webinar series is with an organization called Blue Engine on April 23rd. So if you haven't signed up, feel free to join us there. And you've got the Promise54 website and the College Track website to continue to just follow the story of College Track and even see as the mission changes from one to the next, what else will come from all of this great reflection and deep work that you all are doing over there at College Track. So that's the grand finale for us, with just seconds to spare on time. It's been such a pleasure to see and hear from all of you all across the country and your interest in College Track story, and we hope to see and hear from you again on our next round of calls. Take care to all. Have a wonderful, wonderful day. And, you know, say hello to somebody on video or in person if you can in this crazy, wild time. Thanks all.
Thank you
so much.